The night was moonless and bitterly cold over western Germany. It was the 1st of March, 1945. Somewhere below the aircraft, the Rhine cut through frozen farmland and shattered villages like a dark ribbon pressed into the earth. The Allied front lines were close. The war was in its final weeks. But high above the frozen ground, the fighting had already moved into a different dimension, one measured not in miles of territory or columns of marching infantry, but in pulses of invisible energy bouncing off metal in the dark. 2 men were flying that night inside a massive twin-engine aircraft painted flat black from nose to tail. The pilot was First Lieutenant Herman Ernst of the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron, United States Army Air Forces, 9th Air Force. The radar operator seated behind him was Second Lieutenant Edward Kopsel. The aircraft had carried the nickname Borrowed Time since earlier in Ernst's tour, a small act of dark humor by men who understood the mathematics of night combat. They had been airborne for hours. Ground control, operating under the call sign Nuthouse, had already vectored them toward 4 separate contacts. Each time, the chase had ended without a confirmed kill. Flak had punched through the aircraft's wing on the 3rd attempt. A fuel warning had flickered. A lesser crew might have turned for home. Then the controller's voice returned through the headset. A 5th contact. Bearing 270, range decreasing. In the rear cockpit, Kopsel pressed his face to the radar scope. On the circular display, a pale green blip materialized at the edge of detection range. He read the bearing and altitude aloud in a calm, practiced voice. Ernst banked the aircraft into the dark without a word. The range came down steadily, without the sudden disappearance that meant a contact had descended below ground clutter. At roughly 1,000 feet of separation, Kopsel called the intercept, and Ernst looked up. The aircraft ahead was a Messerschmitt Bf-110, twin-engined, heavy, the same type that had been the backbone of the German night fighter force since 1940. Ernst fired a burst from the 20mm cannon. The Bf-110 took hits, trailed smoke, and dropped away into the darkness below. It was damaged. It could not be confirmed as destroyed. There was no time to wait for it. Kopsel already had a second contact, bearing slightly left, altitude matched. Ernst pulled around without hesitation. The second target was a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. The type had made its name as a dive bomber in the early campaigns of the war, its distinctive sirens screaming in daylight over Poland and France. By the spring of 1945, surviving examples were being used at night for harassment bombing of Allied supply lines behind the front, operating low and slow in darkness where their daytime vulnerability to fighters mattered less. Kopsel brought Ernst in from behind and slightly above. At less than 500 feet of separation, close enough to confirm the shape and exhaust signatures without question, Ernst fired a 2-second burst from the 20mm cannon. The Stuka burned and fell into the frozen fields below. Kopsel had a third contact before the first fire had reached the ground. Ernst came around again. A second, Stuka, another radar-guided approach in the dark, another burst of cannon fire at close range. The second aircraft went down the same way as the first, in flame, into the fields below. 2 confirmed kills in a single patrol, against an aircraft type no one would have associated with the night war. Ernst had his 5 confirmed aerial victories. He was an ace. And neither of the Stuka crews had known any of it was coming. What happened in those minutes defined the arc of a technology that had been quietly reshaping the air war since 1940. A radar system born in a British university laboratory, carried across the Atlantic in a wooden case, and perfected inside. An American research institution had proven one final time that the night sky over Europe had changed hands in a way the Luftwaffe had never fully understood and could no longer reverse. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow was the only aircraft in the Second World War designed from the very beginning as a dedicated radar night fighter. The requirement for such a machine emerged from intelligence on British airborne radar research that reached Army Air Forces planners in late 1940. Major General Delos Emmons had visited England and returned with a detailed picture of British capability. The formal requirement was passed from Army Air Forces leadership through Colonel Lawrence Craigie of Air Technical Service Command, who contacted Northrop's Chief of Research Vladimir Pavleka in October of 1940. Pavleka brought Jack Northrop into the project the following day. The experimental prototype first flew on May 26, 1942, with company test pilot Vance Breese, at the controls at Northrop's Hawthorne, California plant. What emerged from that first flight was an aircraft unlike anything that had preceded it. The Black Widow spanned 66 feet from wingtip to wingtip and weighed more than 30,000 pounds fully loaded. Twin Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines produced up to 2,250 horsepower in the later production variants, pushing the aircraft to more than 360 miles per hour in level flight. The armament was the heaviest combination carried by any single night fighter of the war. 4 20mm Hispano cannon were buried in the lower fuselage. A remotely controlled dorsal turret, the same General Electric unit fitted to the B-29 Superfortress, held 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns. A crew of 3, pilot, gunner, and radar operator, flew the aircraft as a tightly coordinated team. The weapon that truly defined the Black Widow was the device no enemy pilot could detect until it was too late. Housed behind the aircraft's curved fiberglass nose radome was the Signal Corps Radio number 720. This microwave radar operated at roughly 3.3 GHz in the frequency range engineers called the S-band. A rotating 29-inch parabolic dish swept the airspace ahead in a continuous helical pattern, the first production radar to use that scanning method. It could detect an enemy bomber at 5 miles in total darkness and a fighter at 3 miles. The radar operator read bearing, elevation, and range from a dedicated scope display. A smaller repeater screen mounted on the pilot's instrument panel allowed the man at the controls to follow the intercept without ever needing to see the target with his own eyes. 706 Black Widows were built at the Hawthorne plant before production ended. The main runs comprised 200 P-61A aircraft, 450 improved P-61B variants, and 41 turbocharged P-61C aircraft, capable of 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, with a service ceiling above 40,000 feet. Together with prototypes and service test examples, they formed the entire production run. The Black Widow was not merely a fighter that happened to carry radar. It was a radar system that also happened to be a very effective fighter. The story of that radar begins not in California and not in Massachusetts. It begins in a small laboratory room at the University of Birmingham, England, on February 21, 1940. Two physicists named John Randall and Harry Boot had been working for months on a device called a resonant cavity magnetron. On the day of their first successful test, it generated microwave energy at a wavelength of 10 centimeters. The output was modest, but the operating principle was proven. Within months, engineers at the General Electric Company in Wembley refined the design into a pulsed production version delivering approximately 10 kilowatts at that wavelength, roughly 1,000 times greater than anything previously achieved in that frequency range. That was the instrument that would reach America. Radar had existed in several countries since the mid-1930s. The problem was never that radar did not work. The problem was that existing systems used long radio wavelengths, measured in meters. Long wavelengths required large antennas and produced wide, imprecise beams. They could not easily fit inside a small aircraft. Most critically, they could not separate a low-flying target from the radar echoes bouncing back from the ground below it, a technical limitation engineers called ground clutter. Any aircraft trying to intercept another at low altitude was effectively blind with the technology of 1939. A 10-centimeter wavelength changed all of that. A focused dish antenna could produce a beam narrow enough to resolve an individual aircraft from background clutter at ranges and altitudes that had been impossible before. In September of 1940, the British government made a decision that shaped everything that followed. With the Battle of Britain still ongoing, and England facing genuine threat of invasion, Prime Minister Winston Churchill authorized a technical mission to Washington carrying some of Britain's most closely guarded scientific secrets. This was the Tizard Mission, named for its leader, the government scientist Sir Henry Tizard. The team included physicist Edward Bowen, known to colleagues as Taffy, who had pioneered airborne radar research and was now working at the Air Ministry Research Establishment at Worth Matravers on the Dorset coast, and John Cockcroft, who would later receive the Nobel Prize in Physics. On September 19, 1940, the delegation met with American scientists and officials at the Wardman Park Hotel in Washington. Bowen reached into the case he had carried from England and placed the 10-centimeter cavity magnetron on the conference table. Among the Americans in the room was Alfred Loomis, a physicist and Wall Street financier who operated a private research laboratory at his estate in Tuxedo Park, New York, and who chaired the Microwave Committee of the National Defense Research Council. Loomis recognized within minutes that the device on the table was unlike anything American science had produced. The historian James Finney Baxter would later describe what Bowen carried that day as the most valuable cargo ever brought to American shores. The result was the founding of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Radiation Laboratory on November 11, 1940. The name was chosen deliberately to mislead anyone asking what research was underway. It would not be studying radiation in the medical or nuclear sense. It would be building radar. Lee Woodbridge, of the University of Rochester, was appointed director. Isidore Rabi, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Physics, served as associate director. Bowen remained in the United States as the essential liaison between British and American programs. By the war's end, nearly 4,000 people worked at the radiation laboratory. It had placed contracts worth approximately $1.5 billion with American industrial manufacturers. The 28 technical volumes it published after the war, known as the Radiation Laboratory Series, became the standard engineering reference for a generation of post-war electronics researchers. Radiation laboratory veterans would later say that radar won the war and the atomic bomb ended it. Given what the laboratory produced in 5 years, it was not an idle claim. The night sky over Europe in 1943 was one of the most dangerous environments in the history of aviation. The Royal Air Force had been bombing Germany since the earliest months of the war. After early daylight raids produced severe losses, the bomber offensive shifted almost entirely to night operations. Darkness offered concealment from intercepting fighters and anti-aircraft guns during the approach and withdrawal. It also imposed its own costs. Flying in total darkness over hostile territory, navigating by instruments in formation with dozens of other aircraft whose crews could not see one another, finding a target, releasing bombs accurately, and then returning home demanded a combination of skill, precision, and endurance that peacetime aviation had never been required to develop. Germany had built an impressive defense. General Joseph Kammhuber began organizing dedicated night fighter defenses in July of 1940. What he designed was a belt of radar-guided intercept zones, stretching from Denmark through the Netherlands and Belgium into northern France. Each zone, code-named Himmelbett, a German term for four-poster bed, combined a Freya early warning radar, 2 Würzburg precision tracking radars, and a dedicated night fighter assigned to that zone alone. A ground controller watched tracking plots on an illuminated table and guided the fighter crew toward their target by radio. The system was disciplined, systematic, and lethal against bombers flying predictable routes at predictable altitudes. German tacticians recognized early that the Himmelbett system had a fundamental weakness. Each zone could handle only one engagement at a time. When hundreds of bombers passed through a single zone within minutes, the system was overwhelmed. When the Royal Air Force adopted the concentrated bomber stream tactic in the spring of 1942, sending aircraft through a narrow corridor rather than spread across a broad front, the Himmelbett cells were saturated exactly as British planners intended. Germany answered with new methods. Major Hans Joachim Herman developed what the Luftwaffe called Wild Sow, meaning wild boar, in which single-engine dayfighters patrolled over burning target cities, using fires and searchlights below to silhouette bombers against the night sky without needing ground radar guidance at all. The method debuted on the night of July 3rd to 4th, 1943 over Cologne, where Herman's fighters contributed to the loss of 30 Royal Air Force aircraft. The technique had a catastrophic flaw. Single-engine pilots without instrument training regularly became disoriented in bad weather, and attrition through accidents consumed the force faster than combat. By the winter of 1943 to 44, Wild Sow had been largely abandoned. Its replacement was Zahm Sow, meaning tame boar, in which twin-engine night fighters were injected directly into the bomber stream and hunted independently, guided by a running radio commentary that broadcast the stream's position, heading, and altitude to all crews simultaneously. The tactic extended the night fighters' reach far beyond the old Himmelbett boxes and placed experienced crews among the bombers where their short-range radar could find individual targets. German night fighter kills, rose sharply through the winter of 1943 to 44 and reached their peak at Nuremberg. The aircraft that carried out the killing were sophisticated. The Junkers, Ju-88, the Messerschmitt Bf-110, and the Heinkel He-219 were fitted with their own airborne radar. The first German airborne intercept set widely deployed was the Fuji 202 Lichtenstein BC, operating at 490 MHz. It required a cluster of 32 forward-facing dipole antennas that aircrews called Matratze, the German word for mattress. Those antennas created drag and were visible at distance in clear conditions. But they worked against the slow, predictably routed heavy bombers flowing toward German cities in the dark. And the men who flew with them were skilled enough to make the most of them. The men who flew these aircraft became some of the most lethal aviators in the history of aerial warfare. Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, who flew the Bf-110G, and whom enemy aircrews came to know as the Night Ghost of Saint-Trond, scored 121 victories in 164 combat missions, every one of them at night. On the night of February 21, 1945, he destroyed 7 Lancaster bombers in 19 minutes, part of a 9-kill tally for that single day. He survived the entire war, only to die in hospital near Bordeaux in July of 1950, from injuries sustained when gas cylinders fell on him in a road accident, at 28 years old. Major Heinrich Prinz Hussein Wittgenstein scored 83 victories before being killed during the Royal Air Force raid on Magdeburg on the night of January 20 to 21, 1944. He ordered his crew to bail out, and both of them survived. He bailed out himself but appears to have struck the tail section before he could deploy his parachute. His body was found next to the wreckage with an unopened chute. Oberst Helmut Lent flew to 110 victories before dying on October 7, 1944. From injuries sustained when his Junkers Ju-88G6 struck high-voltage power cables while approaching Nordborchen airfield near Paderborn. These men were extraordinary pilots, built and trained to kill heavy bombers flying in predictable formations at predictable altitudes along established routes. They had not been built to fight other radar-equipped fighters hunting alone in the dark. The airfields from which Royal Air Force Bomber Command flew were scattered across the flat eastern counties of England, in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire and Cambridgeshire, places of wide sky suited to long runways and little else. On any given evening before a major operation, the routine followed the same pattern. Ground crews refueled aircraft during the afternoon. Armourers loaded bombs. Meteorologists briefed the crews on weather over the target and the route home. Navigation officers handed out charts marked with turning points and Pathfinder flare codes. The crews ate their pre-mission meals, collected parachute harness, heated suits, oxygen masks, and life preservers, and walked out to the dispersal points in the last of the light. The men who climbed into those aircraft were young. Most bomber captains were in their early 20s. Gunners and navigators were often younger. Some had been at university when the war began. Some had come from farms and factories across Britain, Canada, and Australia. Almost all of them understood, in a way they rarely discussed openly, the statistical reality of what they were doing. A tour of operations was 30 missions. At the peak of German night fighter effectiveness, the average crew did not expect to survive a complete tour. Many stopped planning more than a few days ahead. They wrote letters home, maintained their friendships within the crew, attended briefings, and flew their missions without making plans for a future the numbers suggested was unlikely. Temperatures at operational altitude fell to -40 degrees Celsius or lower. Oxygen equipment was unreliable. Heating systems failed. German searchlights probed the dark from below. Anti-aircraft shells burst at altitude, filling the sky with fragments, and night fighters circled the stream unseen until they opened fire. Those who survived a mission landed in the early hours, debriefed while still in their flight gear, and went to their huts to sleep. The next time their names appeared on the operations board, they went again. The American night fighter crews who arrived in England and North Africa beginning in 1943 flew on a different but equally demanding rhythm. The 415th Night Fighter Squadron, the first United States Army Air Force's night fighter unit in the Mediterranean theater, flew the Bristol Beaufighter, a British twin-engine aircraft transferred to the Americans under reverse Lend-Lease and fitted with airborne intercept radar. The Beaufighter had entered Royal Air Force service in September of 1940. carrying AI Mark IV radar, operating at 193 MHz, though the first confirmed radar-guided kill had come on the night of November 19-20, 1940, when a crew of 604 Squadron downed a Junkers Ju-88 near Chichester. That same radar technology, transferred and fitted to American aircraft, allowed Captain Nathaniel Lindsay and his radar operator of the 415th to score the first aerial victory credited to a United States Army Air Force's night fighter unit in the Mediterranean in July of 1940. 3. A typical patrol lasted 4 to 5 hours. The pilot and radar operator climbed in before last light, the engines settled into cruise, and the pilot contacted ground control and held the assigned area. Most nights nothing came of it. When a vector arrived, the response was immediate. The radar operator swept the scope. If a contact appeared, he called bearing and range in a flat, professional voice. The pilot adjusted heading without taking his hands from the controls. The two men worked in tight coordination, pulling the range down in darkness, guided entirely by what appeared on the display between them. When the radar operator said they were close, the pilot looked up and searched for a shape, a heat shimmer, an exhaust glow, anything that turned the radar's promise into something visible and real. On the night of July 16, 1944, First Lieutenant Herman Ernst and Second Lieutenant Edward Kopsel flew a patrol from Royal Air Force Scorton in northern England. Ground control found a V-1 flying bomb on radar and assigned a vector. The V-1 was small, fast and unmanned, with a distinctive pulsing exhaust from its pulse-jet engine. Kopsel acquired it on the SCR-720 at range. Ernst closed carefully and fired. The flying bomb went down in flames. It was the first combat victory ever scored by a P-61 Black Widow in the European theatre. Over the following months, the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron moved with the advancing Allied armies, relocating from England to Normandy and then east through France into Belgium. By September of 1944, the squadron was based at Florennes, close enough to the front that crews sometimes heard artillery between patrols. When the German Ardennes offensive began in December of 1944, Black Widow crews flew in weather that grounded most Allied air support. On Christmas Day, 1944, Lieutenant Cletus Ormsby of the 425th Night Fighter Squadron destroyed a Dornier Du 217, approaching the encircled garrison at Bastogne. In subsequent engagements before the new year, he added a Junkers Ju-88 and a Messerschmitt Bf-110 to his tally. While the men of the 101st Airborne Division held their perimeter in the snow below, P-61 crews were among the only Allied aircraft able to operate above them. Through the winter of 1944-45 and into the early spring, the 422nd built its record engagement by engagement. The targets varied by night. Some were twin-engine bombers attacking Allied supply depots. Some were reconnaissance aircraft. Some were single-engine types flying so low that conventional radar struggled to separate them from the terrain below. The SCR-720 handled each category. Its 10-centimeter wavelength gave it a resolution advantage at low altitude that the German ground-based systems could not match, and that the German airborne intercept sets, designed primarily to find large bomber formations at altitude, were poorly suited to provide. Ernst's tally before the night of March 1st to 2nd had been built across months of exactly this kind of work. A V-1 destroyed in July. A Messerschmitt Bf-110 destroyed in a November engagement. A Junkers Ju-88 confirmed in December during the Bulge fighting. Each engagement followed the same underlying sequence. Kopsel read the scope and called the intercept. Ernst flew the geometry. The radar closed the range to a point where the German crew was visible before they were aware of being tracked. The advantage of the first shot in night fighter combat was almost always decisive. What made every intercept possible was a gap the Germans could not close. The SCR-720 operated at 3.3 GHz, with a beam narrow enough to resolve aircraft against ground clutter at ranges that had been impossible with earlier long-wavelength systems. The Luftwaffe crews flying within range of a Black Widow could not know they were being tracked until it was too late, because the radar following them operated on a frequency their own passive detection equipment could not register. There was a further dimension to the asymmetry that German crews rarely understood until the moment it killed them. Their passive detection systems were designed to warn when Allied bomber radar emissions were nearby. The Naxos detector homed on the H-2S navigation radar carried by Royal Air Force heavies. The Flensburg device homed on Monica tail warning radar carried by the same aircraft. Both gave German crews advance notice of bombers approaching from behind. Neither could detect a P-61, because the P-61 was not a bomber and did not emit on those frequencies. The Black Widow's SCR-720 was an entirely active system that German detection equipment of that period was not designed to find. A German crew that had survived dozens of engagements against Royal Air Force heavies by using its passive detectors was essentially flying blind in a different sense when a P-61 was behind it. The primary German airborne intercept radar in service by late 1944 was the Fuji 220 Lichtenstein SN-2, operating between 70 and 90 MHz, producing wavelengths of roughly 3 meters. The antenna array required at that wavelength was enormous. German engineers designed an 8-element forward-facing configuration they called Hirschgeweih, meaning stag's antler, which projected from the nose of each aircraft as a forest of poles. Those antennas created significant drag, reducing top speed by as much as 30 miles per hour. The radar they powered could not match the precision the Americans had achieved at centimetric frequencies. A German night fighter with SN-2 could detect a large, slow bomber at useful range. It could not reliably detect a small, fast Black Widow, approaching unseen from behind in darkness. Germany's attempt to close the gap was the Fuji 240 Berlin radar, based on a cavity magnetron recovered from a British bomber carrying H-2S bombing radar, shot down near Rotterdam in February of 1943. The program competed for resources against a war economy under severe and increasing strain. Fewer than 25 units were completed before the war ended, and perhaps 10 were ever operational at one time. The gap was not closed. Then an accident of navigation made things worse. On July 13, 1944, at 04:25 hours, a Junkers Ju-88, G-1, belonging to the 7th Group of Night Fighter Wing, 2 of the Luftwaffe touched down at Royal Air Force Woodbridge in Suffolk. The pilot, Unteroffizier Hans Meckel, had become disoriented over the North Sea and mistaken the British emergency landing strip for a German airfield. He taxied in and shut down his engines before realizing his error. The aircraft was completely undamaged. British intelligence officers arriving at Woodbridge that morning found a functioning Fuji 220 SN-2 radar, a Fuji 227 Flensburg passive homer, and a Fuji 350 Naxos detector, all intact. The analysis was complete within days. Royal Air Force Bomber Command removed Monica radar from all operational bombers within 10 days, eliminating the Flensburg homer with a single order. Window chaff, first used on the night of July 24 to 25, 1943 over Hamburg, was recut to the exact wavelength of the SN-2 and rendered it substantially ineffective within weeks. The last meaningful German radar advantage had been handed over with the aircraft at Woodbridge. This was not the first time German radar had been compromised. In February of 1942, British paratroopers had raided a Würzburg gun-laying and fighter control radar installation at Brunaville on the French coast, removing key components for analysis and directly informing the development of window chaff. In May of 1943, a Junkers Ju-88R1, equipped with Lichtenstein BC radar, had defected to Royal Air Force Dice in Scotland, providing a complete working example of the earlier German system. The Woodbridge landing was the third and most damaging such compromise. In each case, Germany fielded a new radar capability. Allied intelligence found a way to examine it, and within weeks the advantage began to erode. The British contribution to the night battle went far beyond providing the magnetron technology that made American radar possible. Royal Air Force No. 100 Group, formed on November 11, 1943, conducted a sustained campaign to protect the bomber stream through electronic warfare and active intruder operations. Its de Havilland Mosquito night fighters carried a passive homing device called Serat, which tracked German Lichtenstein radar emissions, allowing a Mosquito crew to locate and close on a German night fighter without emitting any radar signal of their own. German crews received no warning on their instruments. The Bristol Beaufighter had entered Royal Air Force night fighter service in the autumn of 1940 with AI Mark IV radar. By the time the Mosquito Night Fighter Mark 30 entered service, it carried AI Mark 10, the British designation for the same SCR-720 set the Americans had installed in the P-61's nose. Both nations had arrived at the same centimetric radar by different paths from the same magnetron technology. Number 100 Group also pioneered the Intruder mission, sending Mosquito crews to loiter over German night fighter bases during takeoff and landing operations, when aircraft were most vulnerable and base lighting gave the best chance of visual contact. These missions were less about shooting down large numbers of aircraft than about making every landing and takeoff a moment of potential danger for men already operating under difficult and exhausting conditions. The psychological effect was severe enough that Luftwaffe night fighter crews coined a specific term for the dread it produced. They called it Mosquito Panic. Wing Commander Ernst of 85 Squadron led Number 100 Group's individual scorers with 21 confirmed claims. The group as a whole destroyed 258 German aircraft for the loss of 70 of its own. The cost of the night war fell very differently on different forces. Royal Air Force Bomber Command lost 55,573 aircrew killed in action, out of roughly 125,000 who served, a fatality rate approaching 44%, the highest sustained casualty rate of any major Allied service branch throughout the war. The single worst night of the campaign came on March 30 to 31, 1944, when 795 aircraft set out for Nuremberg in southern Germany. Unusually clear skies and a strong wind stretched the bomber stream across moonlit air that German night fighters could track and attack at will. 95 aircraft were lost on operations, 11.9% of the entire attacking force. 545 aircrew were killed in a single night. It was the largest single-night loss in the history of strategic bombing and represented the peak of what the Zamsow system could achieve. By contrast, of the 706 P-61 Black Widows built and deployed across multiple theaters, only approximately 4 were confirmed lost to direct enemy action across all units and all operations of the war. The radar that gave American crews the advantage of finding the enemy in the dark also gave them the advantage of approaching unseen. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron's best single night came on April 11, 1945, when 7 German aircraft fell to the squadron in the hours of darkness, the highest single-night total for any United States night fighter unit of the entire war. Lieutenant Eugene Axtell scored his 4th and 5th victories that night and became an ace. The squadron had already produced 2 other aces by that point. Pilot Paul Smith flew with radar operator Robert Tierney, the 2 of them reaching their 5th confirmed kills together on the night of December 26, 1944, in what the American Air Museum records as the moment they became the first United States night fighter aces of the Second World War. Herman Ernst's total stood at 5, completed 2 months later over the Rhine. The 422nd ended the European War, with 43 manned enemy aircraft, confirmed destroyed, and 5 V-1 flying bombs shot down, across approximately 1,480 combat sorties. 6 of the 9 recognized American night fighter aces of the entire war served in that single squadron. The technology that had originated in a Birmingham laboratory in 1940 crossed an ocean in a wooden case, been engineered at a Massachusetts university, and installed in a California factory had given these men a second pair of eyes in total darkness, eyes the enemy could not see and could not jam and had no answer for. Night fighter credits were shared between pilot and radar operator in a way that daytime fighter credits never were, because nighttime kills were genuinely impossible without both. A pilot who could not use his radar operator's readings to manage geometry, speed, and closure rate in complete darkness could not make an intercept. A radar operator who could not translate scope returns into precise verbal instructions, delivered calmly in the right sequence at the right moment, left his pilot flying blind. The kill came from the trigger finger, but everything that made the trigger finger possible came from the man in the rear cockpit and the machine he was reading. Ernst and Kopsel are both remembered as aces. That shared credit reflects a technical reality about what radar-guided night combat required. The highest-scoring American night fighter pilot of the entire war flew not over Germany, but over the Pacific. Major Carroll Smith of the 418th Night Fighter Squadron, 5th Air Force, flew a P-61 he had named Times A Wastin with radar operator First Lieutenant Philip Porter. On the night of December 29 to 30, 1944, over Mindoro in the Philippines, Smith destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft across 2 separate missions before dawn. He finished the war with 7 confirmed aerial victories. The Army awarded him the Silver Star. The final P-61 aerial victories of the war came in August of 1945, when crews of the 548th Night Fighter Squadron completed intercepts over the Pacific without firing a shot, the radar alone sufficient to close on their targets and force them into the sea. Japanese night attacks tended to come at lower altitudes and in smaller numbers than the massed Luftwaffe operations over Europe. The P-61 handled both environments because the SCR-720 and the crew who flew with it were adaptable to whatever the radar found in the dark. The name of Carroll Smith's aircraft, Times Awastin, and the name Borrowed Time, carried by Ernst and Kopsel in Europe, acknowledged with the dark humour of men in dangerous work that every minute above contested ground was a minute that could end without warning. The radar could not eliminate that risk. What it did was shift the odds in a documented direction. The P-61 achieved one of the lowest loss-to-sortie ratios of any aircraft type that flew night operations in the Second World War. Translated into human terms, that ratio was the difference between crews that came home and crews that did not. After the war ended, surviving Black Widows were declared surplus almost immediately. Most were scrapped at government disposal facilities. A handful survived. A P-61C is preserved today at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. A second example stands at the United States Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Standing beneath the aircraft's swept twin-boom tail and its smooth fiberglass nose radome, a visitor can see the shape of what the radar system inside made possible. The radome was designed first. Everything else about the aircraft was built to carry it. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology Radiation Laboratory closed formally on December 31, 1945. Its staff dispersed to universities and research positions across the country. The work did not end. The Research Laboratory of Electronics at the same institution continued fundamental research in microwave and signal processing technologies. From that foundation grew the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Lincoln Laboratory, formally chartered on July 26, 1951, to develop the next generation of American air defense. The first direction center of the semi-automatic ground environment, the system engineers called SAGE, came online in 1958. The full 24-center network reached operational status by 1963 at a total cost of approximately $8 billion, the first large-scale, real-time computerized air defense system ever built. The computing architecture that drove it became the model for automated command and control systems that shape military and civilian computing in modified forms to this day. There is one further consequence of the magnetron that Taffy Bowen carried to Washington in the autumn of 1940, one that has nothing to do with aircraft or the night sky over Germany. Percy Spencer was an engineer at Raytheon, the company that had mass-produced magnetrons for the radiation laboratory during the war. In 1945, while standing near an active magnetron during a routine equipment test, he noticed that a candy bar in his pocket had softened from the microwave energy the device was radiating. He recognized what had happened, filed a patent for a cooking appliance based on the same principle, and developed the first practical microwave oven. Raytheon marketed it commercially as the Red Orange in 1947. Every microwave oven in every kitchen in the world today is a civilian descendant of the device that John Randall and Harry Boot first demonstrated in Birmingham on February 21, 1940. On the morning of March 2, 1945, First Lieutenant Herman Ernst landed Borrowed Time back at Florennes in Belgium as the first grey light showed in the eastern sky. He and Kopsel climbed out, submitted their mission report, ate breakfast, and slept. 2 German aircraft had gone down in the dark that night. Ernst had 5 confirmed victories. The patrol was finished and the record stood. The story of what made that patrol possible runs backward through a chain of decisions beginning years before either of those 2 men joined the war. It runs from the Belgian airfield to the factory in California that built the aircraft, from the factory to the laboratory in Massachusetts that produced the radar, from the laboratory to the hotel room in Washington where a British physicist placed a small copper device on a conference table in September of 1940 and changed what the night sky would mean for the rest of the war. Both nations had invested in radar. Both had produced gifted engineers. The difference was a single act of generosity at a moment of national crisis. A decision by a country fighting for its survival to share its most important secret with a partner that had not yet entered the war, trusting that the outcome would justify the risk. That decision placed a magnetron on a table in Washington in September of 1940. Everything that followed, the radiation laboratory, the factory at Hawthorne, the training programs, the patrols over France and Belgium and Western Germany, and the two Stukas burning in the frozen fields along the Rhine, grew from that one act of trust between nations at the moment when trust had nothing behind it but the hope that the partnership would matter. What the night demanded of the men who flew these patrols was not only courage, though it demanded courage without limit. It demanded precision in complete darkness. It demanded patience through hours of cold waiting when nothing came of it. It demanded the ability to trust a glowing display rather than the senses that evolution had built over hundreds of thousands of years. When the radar operator called a bearing, the pilot had to act on it without seeing a thing. When the guns fired, both men had to trust that the range was right and the identification correct. The two of them had to function as a single instrument, their individual judgments given over to the shared truth of what the scope between them was reading. The young men who flew those patrols are gone now. The last of them gave their accounts in the decades after the war and have since passed on. What remains are the mission reports in the archives at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, the technical manuals in the National Archives, the surviving aircraft in the museums at Washington and Dayton, and the original cavity magnetron from the Birmingham laboratory on display at the Science Museum in London. These are not relics of glory in any simple sense. They are records of a problem solved under pressure, and of a price paid by people whose names appear only in unit rosters and next-of-kin notifications, and the fading memory of whoever was still alive to keep them. The darkness, in the end, belonged to those who understood what they were looking at when the blip appeared on the screen. It belonged to the scientists who built the instrument that made the blip possible. It belonged to the two nations that trusted each other enough to share the technology when one of them had nothing else to offer. And it belonged to the young men with the patience and the nerve to close the range in the dark and do what the radar told them was there. Borrowed time flew again that evening. It always did.